Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here, a U.S. history podcast. Well, we are here. It is finally time, after about 10 hours of me discussing what will be the United States of America. We are getting now today to the point where the United States is actually starting to take shape as the United States, because we're getting into the American Revolution. I thought, first of all, I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes covering the major points of everything that I have done episodes on up to now, because I think it's worthwhile just to give you a sense, if you're watching this and if you've watched all the previous episodes, what I think you would have wanted to take away from those episodes, why I did them, and what are just the major bullet points, really, of what I hope someone would have learned from watching or listening to those episodes. So I'm going to run back through those real quick, and then I'm going to get into the stuff that led to 13 British colonies forming what would eventually be the United States of America. Normally, I start off every episode by giving everybody 3 questions that I hope that anyone who listens to the episodes or watches the episodes can answer thoughtfully. In this case, I'm going to start with these major ideas that I hope you would have taken away from the previous episodes. And then I'm going to make a little change. Well, I think actually a pretty significant change from what I've been doing. Up to now, I had structured all of these episodes in such a way that they would be almost kind of units of study, and I think that was not necessarily conducive to this format. So going forward, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pose one question that I hope to answer per episode. The episodes are going to be a little bit shorter. Going forward, I'm going to focus on one question that anybody watching or listening would be able to answer, ideally, after having viewed or listened to the episode. Without further ado, let me just briefly go through what I think are the major things that anyone who's been following along so far should be able to write about or think about or talk about pretty intelligently. First of all, the origins of European colonialism. That's something that I've talked about quite a bit. Why Europeans became the colonizers instead of, say, Africans or Asians or Native Americans. Why they colonized in the manner that they did. They did it a particular way. I've talked about that a lot, and they could have gone lots of ways. Why'd they do it the way they did? Which Europeans did the colonizing and when? What Native American civilizations were like before Columbus? That's something I talked about a lot in the first episode. How Native Americans reacted to European arrival. The role and prominence of the slave trade. England's entry into New World colonialism, and Ireland's role in how England entered into New World colonialism. I spent most of an episode on that. Why colonists went from England or other parts of what we now call the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, to the New World. What were the motivations of people who left the Old World, the UK, and came to the New World? What kinds of governments and societies those people who left the Old World, who left the UK, established once they came to the New World. The relationship between English and colonial governments, both in terms of how much England influenced the way that those colonial governments looked, and in terms of what levels of interaction or control, or just what the dynamic was like between the colonies in North America and the English government. Mercantilism, talked a few times about that, what it is and why it matters. How colonies created conflict with Native Americans. And then finally, European conflicts spilling over into North America. All of those things are kind of big ideas I spent a pretty significant amount of time talking about. Now it's the real shit. Now we're getting into the United States as an independent country, how that happens, why it happens, and what are the consequences of that? Because after all, this podcast is called How the Hell Did We Get Here? And a pretty good place to start to answer that question is what was the United States formed to achieve? Or what were the circumstances that led it to come into being? I would say that most Americans have some sense of why it is that the colonies rebelled. I think you would probably get a lot of different kinds of answers from people. If you went up to like 1,000 random people on the street somewhere and asked them, hey, why'd the United States have a revolution, break away from Great Britain? I think you would get some answers that would come up a lot. Taxes. To have greater liberty and freedom might be an answer. The governments were just in conflict with each other might be an answer. Maybe somebody might say some version of all three of those things combined. And maybe some other people might say something totally different. I think it is really important to think about why all this happened. What were the motivations? And what were the circumstances that brought it about? Because I don't think it's necessarily a foregone conclusion that the American Revolution was going to occur. I don't think that much in history is inevitable. And people will disagree. I mean, there are really smart people. There are historians who know this stuff way better than I ever will that totally disagree with each other. I'm just going to try to give you what I've learned about it, the interpretations that make the most sense to me, and what I think all Americans should know about it, whether you might agree with the same interpretations I do or not. So, the last thing I discussed in the previous episode was the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. And I alluded to the fact that that had a very potent impact on the colonies, on Great Britain, and on the relationship between the colonies on the one hand and Great Britain on the other hand. And that's the first thing I'm really going to focus on. So the first question I have to, well, the question, the only question in this case, as I said that I'm going to do going forward, the only question I have to answer is, how did the French and Indian War dramatically alter the relationship between Britain and the North American colonies? So that's the question I'm going to seek to answer in this episode. And there's some new materials that I have to use for this episode. There's the old standbys, and I think going forward, I'm just going to mention them very quickly and move on. There is The American Pageant, which is a textbook I've mentioned a bunch. There is Give Me Liberty, which is another U.S. history textbook I've mentioned a bunch. So in terms of new material, there is a terrific series of books that are, I will say from the outset, they're no joke. They're not for somebody who doesn't like to read. I found them tremendously helpful. It's the Oxford History of the United States series of books. You may have heard of some of these if you are a history nerd like me. For this episode and for a few episodes, there's this book called The Glorious Cause. This was a phenomenal book, and it was really valuable to me in terms of learning about the Revolution and the years leading up to the Revolution and the years following the Revolution and how the Constitution was formed and so forth. Another book that I used pretty substantially when I was doing this is The Cause. And the subtitle is The American Revolution and Its Discontents, 1773 to 1783, and that is by Joseph J. Ellis, who I don't think I had read anything by before I picked this up, and it's not super long, and it's pretty accessible in terms of how readable it is. I don't think it's something that's like super difficult to read and understand. And then there is John Meacham's biography of Thomas Jefferson, his Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. Those are the books I mostly use to plan this episode and to plan future episodes. There's also Before the Revolution, which I mentioned in previous podcasts, that does cover the 7 Years' War and gets into a little bit of the aftermath of it. And that'll be the last time probably I mention that book because it really ends with the 7 Years' War. So, again, the question is, how did the French and Indian War dramatically alter the relationship between Britain and the North American colonies? I have talked a lot about the often fraught relationship between the North American colonies, the 13 colonies, and Great Britain. And there's a lot of reasons that that relationship was fraught. I've talked about the religious differences between people in the colonies and back in Great Britain. I mentioned most recently that England, at least, was pretty religiously homogenous, that it was pretty much all Anglicans by the time you get to the mid-1700s. Scotland was pretty much all Presbyterian, sure, and that's part of the UK, and Ireland is mostly Catholics, but they're more or less getting along. The colonies had a lot of religious diversity because the Congregationalists, the Puritans had formed their churches in New England. There were Anglicans that were the majority in places like Virginia, and a big chunk of the population in Maryland and in South Carolina and places like that. There were Presbyterians who came over from Scotland or whose forebears had come over from Scotland, and they didn't really dig on the Church of England all that much or ecclesiastical authority in general. And then there's all these new denominations that come about because of the Great Awakening in the 1720s, 30s, 40s, like the Baptists and the Methodists. That's one cause for friction between Great Britain on the one hand and the colonies on the other hand, is all of this religious diversity and all of these religious differences. That's going to cause drama and disagreements and all kinds of problems that happened in Europe in the 1516 into the 1700s and happened internally within the colonies as well. There was no shortage of religious conflict just internally among people in Massachusetts and people in Rhode Island and people in Maryland, as we have discussed already. There's also conflict between the colonies and Great Britain in terms of the economic situation. The British, they believe in mercantilism, certainly the people in authority do. And under that system, they're supposed to dictate a lot of what the colonies are supposed to do. And the colonies are generally supposed to only trade with Britain. But as we've already discussed, the colonies, they don't dig that shit. They're not about it. They want to do their own thing, partially because they just want to do their own thing, and that's kind of human nature, and partially because they think, or at least they postulate, that they might get better prices for their stuff and be more prosperous if they're allowed to trade with whomever they want, however they want, if it's more of a free market, as opposed to the mercantilist system I just described, and I described in detail in previous episodes. And then there is just the political arrangement. Britain is a constitutional monarchy. Generally, what that means is you've got a constitution which, as I pointed out in a previous episode, no one can hand to you or to me or anybody a copy of the British Constitution. It's a collection of laws that kind of makes a Frankenstein's monster of a constitution in a way. That's not to say it's bad. It's just this weird jigsaw puzzle of different things that have been put together over centuries. But there is a monarch, and that monarch is limited to a large degree in what he can do after the Glorious Revolution especially, because Parliament is there, the legislature, and it limits to a large degree what the monarch can do, because Parliament has controlled the purse strings, and it passes laws and all sorts of other reasons. The colonists have very much pushed away the notion of monarchy. There are royal governors in charge of most of the colonies by the time you get to the mid-1700s. However, there are colonies where that very much is not the case either, like Rhode Island. There is also, in many of the colonies, a very, very legislature-loving streak. Democracy, as I've already mentioned in previous episodes, is a hell of a lot more important to a lot of the colonists than it is to people in the UK. They, the colonists, have grown up over generations having a lot of elections for a lot of different levels of government. And they've gotten used to the notion that they choose their leaders and that they have a role in their government, which is not the thinking of a lot of people in Britain. Even though there is a parliament, voting rights are very limited in the UK in the 1700s. It's not until you get to the really second half of the 1800s that more and more people in Britain start to get the right to vote. And of course, it's not until the 20th century that like half the population, women, get the right to vote or hold office or anything like that. There's just a very different perspective on a lot of kind of fundamental aspects of society, religion, the economy, government in the colonies, and what is perceived to be appropriate in the UK and Britain. And those differences start to become more and more a source of conflict, a source of friction between the colonies on the one hand and Great Britain on the other hand. And it really kind of starts to become a major problem during and after the French and Indian War. I should remind you that the French and Indian War is the end of what is known as the period of salutary neglect. The core thing that you want to understand is that from 1690 to the mid-1750s, there was very little involvement by Great Britain in the day-to-day lives of colonists, or even in the sort of big picture stuff. Yeah, they passed a number of navigation acts. Yeah, they were sort of kind of a little bit enforcing them, but they really weren't paying that much attention to the colonies. And that's partially because the colonies pushed back really hard when Great Britain tried to institute greater control during the Dominion of New England. But it's also because of the way that the British in general, the British government and the British population, perceived the 13 colonies. And this is, I think, really important to understand. How did Great Britain, both the government and the average people, look at the 13 colonies? Certainly not as a future superpower. The way they generally looked at the 13 colonies is, this is a place where we can get rid of people we don't want. Remember I said that the attitude of a lot of British people to the Puritans leaving, to poor people leaving as indentured servants, was good riddance. See you later. All you religious troublemakers, all you poor people, don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out. They also looked at the colonies as, at best, a supplier of some kind of important raw materials, and maybe a supplier of foodstuffs to the colonies they really cared about, they really were interested in, the sugar-producing colonies of the Caribbean. Those are the big moneymakers. Those are the colonies the British actually gave a shit about. The 13 colonies, not so much. So it was easy for the British to just ignore them for decades. But all that comes to a screeching halt when the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, whatever you want to call it, begins in 1754. Because now the British are sending all these troops, and now the British are spending all this money on fighting the French and Native Americans in this place, and they're trying to hold on to it because, in part, they feel they have an obligation to protect their British subjects in these colonies, and because they want to control North America. That's just the general attitude of big European powers at this time, and kind of just the general attitude of great powers in the world since that's been a thing, right? We want more territory if we can get it. The 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, is the end of salutary neglect. And it means a lot more interaction all of a sudden between Britain and British soldiers in particular, and British government officials in particular, and the colonists. And as one Benjamin Franklin is said to have written, although this quote is attributed to him, it probably isn't something he invented, but he was a guy that liked aphorisms. Of course, he published Poor Richard's Almanac, which was full of those kinds of things. But one of the expressions that is attributed famously to Benjamin Franklin is, fish and house guests both begin to stink after 3 days. That's obviously a metaphor to illustrate that people shouldn't overstay their welcome. And I think that is appropriate when thinking about how the British came across to the colonists. It didn't go well. Kind of from the outset, the colonists looked at the British presence in the colonies as a pain in the ass, and as something that they'd rather not have to deal with. They saw it as unnecessary in a lot of cases, like, hey, we can take care of ourselves, we don't need you guys here. The colonists were annoyed that the British soldiers were there, staying in public buildings, And this is something that the British government mandated, the Quartering Act, which meant that the British soldiers had to be housed by the colonists in some fashion. What this typically meant is that the British soldiers would stay in like taverns or something like that overnight when they weren't being operated. But as you might imagine, that's kind of a burden on the guys running the taverns or the warehouses or wherever it was that the British would be put up. On top of that, when the British soldiers weren't soldiering and they had an opportunity to just kind of kick it or work, a lot of them chose to work. And a lot of them competed with colonists, many of whom were laborers, for odd jobs. That didn't engender a lot of good feelings between many of the colonists and the British. When they're competing with each other for work, and some colonists see this as an opportunity to gain favor with the British government. And there's already, as I've discussed, this notion amongst a lot of the colonists that they're not really British. And some of the colonists weren't British at all. A lot of these were, as I said, German immigrants, maybe from France. I've already discussed this notion that a lot of the British colonists didn't really think of themselves as British. And there were like a lot of Scottish immigrants, for example, that were pretty hostile to English people. It was real easy to ratchet up the tension between the colonists on the one hand and the British on the other hand, and having to compete with British soldiers for work was a way that that tension got ratcheted up yet again. And then finally, one last thing that I think is worth mentioning when it comes to how the British presence grated on the colonists is that many of the British soldiers very much internalized this attitude over in Britain that I've already mentioned of the colonists being lesser than, of them being cast-offs. They were people in the minds of many British soldiers, the colonists were, who couldn't hack it in Britain. There's a line in the movie Unforgiven that I'm thinking of right now when English Bob gets the shit kicked out of him by Gene Hackman, and he's being let out of town. He's bitter, he's angry, and he's hollering at all these people in this small town in Wyoming, and he's saying, "You bunch of uncivilized heathens, you got no laws, you got no morals, and that's why you're here, is because your ancestors couldn't hack it in England." That's not exactly what he says, but that's the basic spirit of what he says, is that you're here because you weren't wanted in England. That attitude of, you're here because you weren't good enough to be in England, that's something that English Bob is saying to these townspeople in the late 1800s, but it's also very much an attitude that British soldiers had when they interacted with colonists in the mid-1700s. And all of that meant that the imposition that the British soldiers would exact on the colonists by having to stay there and eat their food and take up lodgings in their buildings, the increased authority of various bureaucrats and government officials from Great Britain who are now more present in the colonies, and then finally just this whole general attitude of the British Army, officers, regular enlisted men, and even some of these government officials just looking down their noses at the colonists. That did not go over well, as you might imagine. And it created a lot of tension in an already tense situation in which, as I said, many colonists believed that the British Army weren't necessary and that they had very much overstayed their welcome like a stinky fish. There's a lot of reasons that the relationship between Britain and the colonies wasn't great in the years preceding the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, whatever you want to call it. And as I just said, there were a number of things about the dynamic of the relationship that got worse because of the interaction between the colonists and the British military for the most part, but also British government officials during the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, whatever you want to call it. I now want to discuss the last thing before I end this episode. What was the aftermath of the French and Indian War? First of all, Britain was in I think the technical term is a shitload of debt. Okay, even before the war happened, Britain had been in a lot of international conflicts. I mentioned Queen Anne's War, I mentioned King William's War. Britain was managing a huge colonial empire, even at that time, and fighting all these wars is super expensive. You know, if you look at the United States budget now, the federal budget, military expenditures are a just gargantuan piece of the amount of money that we spend our tax dollars on, because feeding and supplying and sending to different places, transporting troops is tremendously expensive. And that was certainly the case with the 7 Years' War. And even before it started, as I said, the British were in a lot of debt. To give you some numbers, to put some numbers to that, Britain was in, before the 7 Years' War started, Britain was in debt of about 75 million pounds. It's a lot of money, and this is at a time when military budgets weren't what they are now, and when tax revenues certainly were not what they are now. So I'll put that in perspective a little bit. The debt did double by 1763, from 75 million pounds to about 140 million pounds, or the equivalent of $44 billion in today's money. And again, it's a lot more impactful because tax revenues in the mid-1700s were not nearly what they are now. The governments of Europe and, you know, the colonies and all other parts of the world, as they existed, they took in tax money, sure, but they didn't take in nearly as much tax money as is taken in these days, in large part because they just didn't do as much stuff. So when you're talking about the equivalent of $44 billion in 1763, that is just an astronomical sum that it's almost difficult for people of that time to wrap their heads around. That amount of debt was 14% of Britain's national income. And almost half the budget was going to paying interest on Britain's loans that it had taken out for debts on the war. Okay, so it was freaking a lot of people out who looked at the numbers in the government at that time. The British government attempted to, as a result of all of this debt, control trade between whites and natives on the frontier. And also, they wanted to try to keep the peace. But it just wasn't very easy for Britain to do. In fact, it was quite difficult for Britain to do for reasons that I've already discussed in previous episodes. All the distance, all the distance between Britain and the colonies, that made it very difficult to regulate things. And then just the wide swath of territory where trade is going on between Native Americans and Europeans or European descended peoples. It's almost impossible for a government at that time with the technology that existed to really regulate. And generally speaking, all this did was anger the colonists and anger the natives to some degree as well. So it really was almost totally counterproductive, these attempts to try to regulate trade so that the British government could take in more money and try to pay off this debt that it had accrued. The British government also attempted to halt all purchases of native land by requiring direct approval from London for these sales. You get that? So you can't buy any more native land if you're an American colonist from the Native Americans without express approval from London, which, just imagine the process of how that would work. You'd have to draw the deal up, send it to London, which takes at least a couple of months, have somebody actually take a look at it, approve it, send it back, which again takes at least a couple of months. So you're talking about like what would be probably a 6-month process at minimum. And that's probably being generous. So it wasn't easy to do. And as I have said in this episode and in previous episodes, probably the single biggest motivation of colonists to be in North America in the first place was to own land. And certainly that was a big motivation of the wealthy plantation class or the wealthy merchant class in the colonists. They wanted more land to invest in, to build up, to get more resources from. And that was already a source of conflict between the British government, British authorities, and the wealthy elite colonial classes that kind of ran things in the colonies. The wealthy elite colonial classes, wanted more land by any means necessary. And the British government wanted to maintain the peace. And the British government recognized that the drive to get more and more land was causing, and had the potential to cause, a lot of conflict between colonists on the one hand and Native Americans on the other hand, because colonists often just screwed Native Americans out of their land in various ways. And that made the Native Americans angry, and then you'd have potentially a war on. And that is the last thing that the British government wanted at this point, was some new source of conflict and new war that they would have to get involved in between the Native Americans and their colonists, and that might also suck France or Spain back in again. The British government is just throwing its body in front of any kind of land deals that might create potential conflicts between colonists and Native Americans. Despite their best efforts, though, the British government's best efforts, inevitably conflict emerged. And there was a massive rebellion, a very famous rebellion, that took place almost immediately after the French and Indian War ended. It is known as Pontiac's Rebellion. The Ohio River Valley was to colonists of the mid-1700s what California became to gold prospectors in the mid-1800s. It was just like, oh, there's this amazing land that is so fertile and so easy to farm, and it's just sitting there. Except, of course, it's not just sitting there. There's lots and lots of Native Americans who occupy that territory and don't want to see white people come in and take it from them, as undoubtedly they had heard had happened to Native Americans further to the east. The Native Americans rose up and tried to fight back against it. Many of them had been allied with the French during the French and Indian War. They'd been on the losing side, and they wanted to try to halt the expansion of colonists westward into their territory. Some natives even considered forming some kind of grand Native American alliance that would put all of these Native Americans together under one kind of massive tribe. And that was a movement that was led by a prophet figure, he is called Neolin or Neolin. I'm not sure how that is pronounced, if I'm being honest. Neolin was a Delaware Native American of that tribe, and he tried, as did some others, to encourage all Native Americans of all tribes in that region, in Appalachia, the Ohio River Valley, areas just to the north and south and east of there. He wanted to encourage all of them to come together and stand up and push back and fight against European encroachment on their land. It was a difficult sell to a lot of Native Americans, from my understanding. Some of them thought it was a really good idea, and they got on board right away, and they certainly thought it was preferable to having white people come in and just take their land at some future date. Push them aside violently if necessary, or take their land through various means of negotiating and legal chicanery. So just to be clear, Neolin or Neolin was a Delaware or Lenape Native American who advocated for this sort of union of Native American tribes to push back against European encroachment on their land and against European cultural influence over their nations of people. And Pontiac was an Ottawa chief who was influenced by Neolin's teachings and actually led a movement similar to what Neolin was advocating for. Okay? As soon as the French and Indian War was over and the French and many of the Native American tribes were on the losing side of it, Pontiac aggressively adopted Neolin's philosophy, united a number of Native American tribes around his movement, and then launched attacks all along the frontier to try to prevent British subjects, European colonists, however you want to think of them, from moving westward into the Ohio River Valley west of the Appalachian Mountains. And as you might expect, as we have talked about in a number of instances before, there was a colonial white backlash against Native Americans in the wake of Pontiac's rebellion. Probably the most famous example of the violence that took place was the incident carried out by the guys who are known as the Paxton Boys. And that took place in Pennsylvania, and it was a group of frontiersmen in Pennsylvania who, as part of the whole white-red violence that I discussed in previous episodes, indiscriminately attacked Native Americans, regardless of whether they were part of the tribes that engaged in Pontiac's rebellion or other kinds of violence against white people on the frontier. And the Paxton Boys launched this attack against Native Americans in Pennsylvania who had really nothing to do with Pontiac and his rebellion and other natives who were taking part in violence against people on the frontier. A number of Native Americans were killed who were kind of at least somewhat ingratiated into white society at that point, but because they were Native Americans, they looked to these guys like the bad guys, quote unquote, and they were injured and killed, and only stopped when the government of Pennsylvania essentially assured these people who became a part of this movement that they would do something to combat the Native American attacks. The violence of Native Americans who are fearing for their way of life and for their territory begets violence by white people. The British are looking at this like, oh shit, this is exactly what we didn't want. And it became obvious to the British that the empire would need permanent security for the 13 colonies in Canada to guard against attacks by Native Americans or by the Spanish or the French. They can't just walk away, as maybe some in the British government had hoped that they would, or that they could, because they were spending a lot of money, and they had spent a lot of money to do all of this. And I know I've read that there were a number of people in the British government who were just like hoping against hope that they could wash their hands of having to spend all this money to secure these colonies, which, again, from their point of view, were not all that important or valuable to begin with. They were a lot more interested in the sugar-producing colonies and not these backwoods dumping grounds for people that they didn't really want. It's the way they looked at it. You start to see here the recipe for a more permanent British presence and the friction, the tension, the conflict that would create with the colonists. This is the first seeds really being planted for revolution at this point. Not only that, but there are some people, including William Pitt, the Secretary of State, and the guy who would eventually become Prime Minister, who criticized the Treaty of Peace with the French, the Treaty of Paris of 1763. He, Pitt, and many in the colonies, many colonial leaders, especially those who'd fought in the war for Britain, thought of the treaty as a sellout. They thought they were giving up too much. From what I've read, it was a little bit of an exaggeration and maybe kind of an unfair criticism of the treaty, but that's what they thought. The reason they thought that is they'd already given up Louisbourg, and they were, in the treaty, making accommodations of certain kinds with the Native American tribes. They were not just kind of taking everything they wanted. And that was because, from the British point of view, they're trying to calm things down. They're trying to keep the peace. From the British point of view, it's not worth it to continue to engage in the warfare in order to grab more territory. But from the colonial point of view, that's totally worth it. That's absolutely what they want. It's just the first of many examples of the colonists think one thing and the British think another thing in terms of like how all this should be conducted and what should happen. Okay, the colonists are all in favor, for the most part, of aggressively pursuing land acquisition, even if that means violence against Native Americans, even if that means war. And the British, for the most part, are kind of like, nah, let's chill. We've fought enough. We've spent enough money. Let's just calm things down. You start to see this difference between how some colonists feel about their relationship to Britain and how other colonists feel. Some are feeling as British as ever. They're proud. They had just come through this conflict. They defeated France. They'd taken almost total dominion over North America. But some were increasingly suspicious of and hostile toward Britain because they felt like the treaty sold them out. They had gotten all of this uppity, looking down your nose kind of treatment from British officials and from British military officers and just average soldiers. They were forced to provide all this stuff for the British military, and they're now being watched. The colonists are being watched a lot more closely and are being forced to obey the rules, like the Navigation Acts that have been put in place starting in the 1650s and continued in the 1700s but weren't really enforced. Now they're starting to actually be enforced. So all of this is creating an environment in which the two sides are starting to really rub each other the wrong way, and you see the seeds for revolution. So, thanks very much, as always, for listening. I appreciate your time. Going forward, as I said, I'm just going to deal with each of these three questions I've been posing throughout a particular area of study one at a time. So this question again was, how did the French and Indian War dramatically alter the relationship between Britain and the North American colonies? If you'd like to contact me, if you have any feedback, any critiques, you have some advice for me about the show, hit me up. You can contact me at howthehelldiwegethherepod@gmail.com, or you can text or leave a voicemail at 951-525-5536. Thanks as always for tuning in or for listening. I appreciate it, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.